Emotions and desire in the great Upanishads. At what point does the idea arise that something is wrong with desires and that they should be avoided, or they should be feared, or there is some kind of tension? Perhaps the first text in which some hint of this appears is the Katha Upanishad. As you remember, the plot of the Katha Upanishad is approximately as follows. A certain young man, Nachiketas, having got into the world of the Yama, and not be invited to the table, being a Brahmin, receives in compensation for moral damage from the Yama the possibility of fulfilling several of his desires. As a first wish, Nachiketas asks Yama to stop his father being angry with him. As a second, he asks for the good things for his father. And as a third, he asks rather complex philosophical questions about the nature of death, the nature of life, the nature of yoga, etc. Yama does not want to answer these questions because he says that these questions are difficult, even for gods. When Nachiketas says, "Tell me, O Yama, when a man is dead, does he exist or not?" And Yama says, "This is a difficult question, Nachiketas. Even the gods find it difficult to answer it." But nevertheless, Nachiketas insists, and Yama begins to tell Nachiketas some considerations regarding philosophy, let's say, of the yoga of that period. And when Nachiketas seems to insist, in particular, on the request to Yama, Yama offers him to pay off. He says, "Here are elephants, horses for you, women for you, benefits for you, 100 years of life for you. Don't ask me this hard question." But Nachiketas insists, saying, "Our life is short. May you keep your carts, dances, singing. Man should not enjoy in wealth. How can we possess wealth if we see you, O Yama, the god of death?" In other words, a man who has already seen death, he is not so happy with wealth. In fact, this statement of Nachiketas is not indisputable. I would say that at this moment we are confronted for the first time with a little bit of pessimism, which quietly laid down on Indian culture. However, sometimes this pessimism has separated from it. Here are the same considerations for comparison, because if a human life is short, so she can enjoy it. The same question is in other philosophical, or even not philosophical, but cultural, lyrical, etc. Texts were decided differently. For example, there was such a magnificent medieval poet, Vidyapati, who wrote lyric love songs, and he wrote the following: "Our youth is short, and happy are those who have the time to know all pleasures of it. The pleasure of youth is only in love, the rest is just fiction and obsession." That's how much, let's say, the same initial conditions of the problem in a completely different conclusion. If we take, for example, some modern philosophy in the spirit of Heidegger, then Heidegger said the following, that the feeling of mortality gives us the feeling of the right to experience the fullness of life, so we can solve this problem differently. But the Indian tradition began to solve it in such a way that is, in fact, the feeling of mortality began to weaken. At least at first glance, some experiences associated with desires. And if we read the Katha Upanishad further, in particular the beginning of the second chapter, then Yama approves this view of Nachiketas, or the author of the Upanishad by mouth of Yama, so to speak, approves this view of Nachiketas and says that, yes, indeed, this is correct. Truly there is good positive shreyas and a pleasant preyas, and both with different goals fetter human discretion. It is good for the one who holds on to the good, and the goal of the one who chooses the pleasant perishes. That's usually when analyzing this line, people begin to say that really shreyas and preyas are different directions, and shreyas are really something high, and preyas is a desire. But if we carefully analyze it, we will realize that in fact we are still talking about something else, because preyas is that which is pleasant right now, and shreyas, or good, are those desires that have a more long-term perspective. In fact, we're not talking about the abandonment of desires in the Katha Upanishad, but rather about that same marshmallow test, about the readiness to choose something more long-term to the detriment of something more short-term, to realize not momentary, simple desires, but some kind of long-term, really distant, etc. And Yama continues, Both the good and the pleasant come to man. Reasonable man, after thinking, distinguishes them, because the reasonable prefers the good to the pleasant. The stupid man, for the sake of worldly well-being, chooses the pleasant. You, Nachiketas, after thinking, threw away the desires that are pleasant or seem pleasant. You did not follow the path of wealth, which many people were stuck on. In fact, I would say that there is still no talk about the abandonment of desires as such. Rather, there is a talk about increasing the degree of strategic importance. It is not clear for what reason not to rush into the first available desire, or desires connected simply with usual enrichment. It must be said that another Upanishad, also from the oldest cycle, from the most ancient Upanishads, the Taittriya Upanishad, is arguing with the Katha Upanishad. So I call this Taittiriya Upanishad the most holistic of all Upanishads, because it addresses the issue in another way. If the Katha Upanishad is such the harshest of the Upanishads, which clearly defines the good, the pleasant, this is, so say, meditation on death, etc., then the Taittiriya Upanishad is something else. It is rather a meditation on life. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, there are a lot of, let's say, some grounds of what we consider modern yoga. For example, the concept of thin bodies is set forth firstly in the Taittiriya Upanishad. The idea of the possibility to develop yourself, practicing some kind of practice, understanding something, is set forth firstly in the Taittiriya Upanishad. There is a whole chapter of the Upanishad that is sung as a hymn. I will comprehend the truth, svadhyaya, studying it, and pravachananecha, proclaiming it. But further, in the same text are listed such words: I will study a family, studying and proclaiming it, posterity, studying and proclaiming, etc. In fact, it is very interesting that in this Upanishad, aspects of life are perceived as both aspects of spirituality and development. But this is a slightly different topic. And here we will return to another aspect concerning the attitude to food. Here is one of the last chapters of the Taittiriya Upanishad devoted to food. It is in the Taittiriya Upanishad that the famous Mahavakya contains the words, "You are food, and you are a food eater." It means that a man is involved in the cycle of being as the one who consumes and as the one who is eaten, so to speak, starting from physically eating of us by worms and ending with the fact that we are the food for other people, sharing with them our experiences, thoughts, emotions, states, etc., as they are the food for us. It means that there is some circulation. And at the end of this Upanishad, one of the fundamental statements of this very Taittiriya Upanishad, which to some extent, as for me, argues with the Katha Upanishad, you will see this statement: He does not reproach with food, such is the commandment. He does not despise food, such is the commandment. He does not turn away from food, meaning the practitioner, such is the commandment. He does prepare a lot of food, because the earth is food. The space for eating food, food is based on food. As you can see, in this Upanishad, this ascetic view on abandonment of desires is clearly not present, but rather there is some message for engaging in the circulation, for experiencing all this. That's such a funny controversy.